Bernie Sanders has long been recognized as a political figure who places public health, social justice, and the well-being of ordinary citizens at the center of his agenda. His comments are rarely offhand, and when he speaks on an issue, it is usually deliberate and focused on sparking a broader conversation. Recently, Sanders made a statement that may seem simple on the surface, but in reality, it touches on one of the most contentious issues in American society today: vaccines. He said, "What we want to talk about is Kennedy's views on vaccines." This remark may appear like a passing comment directed at Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but in fact, it reflects deep concerns about misinformation, science, politics, and the power of public opinion. To understand why Sanders' words carry weight, one must look at the broader context of American politics and the history of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Kennedy is a well-known figure not only because of his famous family name but also because of his long-standing involvement in environmental activism and politics. Yet, over the years, he has gained notoriety for his vocal skepticism toward vaccines. While most politicians avoid entering debates that pit science against conspiracy, Kennedy has made it a defining aspect of his public identity. Sanders' call to discuss Kennedy's views is therefore not merely about a rival candidate or political opponent. It is about ensuring that the public does not lose sight of the scientific consensus that vaccines save lives. When Sanders says that the conversation should be about Kennedy's views on vaccines, he is attempting to steer political dialogue away from superficial arguments about personality or popularity. Instead, he wants the public to focus on substance. Vaccines are not an abstract issue, they have been central to public health victories in the United States and across the globe. From eradicating smallpox to controlling polio, measles, and diphtheria, vaccines represent some of humanity's greatest achievements in medicine. Questioning their legitimacy without solid evidence is not just an intellectual exercise, it has consequences for millions of people who rely on herd immunity and public trust to keep deadly diseases at bay. Sanders understands this and insists that the real debate must be about whether Kennedy's views are compatible with protecting public health. Kennedy's stance on vaccines has often been framed as a defense of personal freedom and skepticism toward big pharmaceutical corporations. This rhetoric appeals to certain segments of the American population who are already wary of government institutions and medical authorities. In recent years, this sentiment has grown stronger, fueled by social media, misinformation, and political polarization. Sanders recognizes that left unchallenged, these ideas can spread quickly and undermine decades of progress in building trust between health authorities and citizens. That is why he emphasizes the need to bring Kennedy's views into the open, not to silence him, but to ensure the public hears both sides and can recognize where science stands. In a democratic society, debates about health, freedom, and government oversight are natural. But Sanders seems to argue that this particular issue cannot be treated like a typical political disagreement. This is not about tax policy or foreign affairs, it is about life and death, about whether children are protected from preventable diseases, and whether society values scientific evidence over unfounded speculation. For Sanders, Kennedy's position on vaccines is not simply wrong, it is dangerous, and therefore, it deserves scrutiny at the highest levels. Moreover, Sanders' statement reflects a deeper concern about the nature of modern politics. In today's world, political campaigns are increasingly dominated by personalities, soundbites, and viral moments rather than substantive debates. Candidates with controversial or provocative ideas can gain traction quickly by appealing to emotion rather than fact. Kennedy's criticism of vaccines fits perfectly into this mold, capturing attention through controversy rather than evidence. Sanders, by contrast, wants to reframe the conversation. Instead of being dazzled by Kennedy's charisma or family legacy, voters should critically evaluate the consequences of his beliefs. This perspective is especially significant in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The crisis exposed the fragility of public trust in health systems and highlighted how quickly misinformation can spread. Millions of people worldwide expressed skepticism about COVID vaccines, despite overwhelming scientific evidence of their effectiveness. In the United States, vaccine hesitancy became a deeply political issue, dividing communities along partisan lines. Against this backdrop, Kennedy's anti-vaccine rhetoric resonates with a portion of the population that has already been primed to distrust official guidance. Sanders knows that if this skepticism becomes further legitimized in mainstream politics, it could weaken public health infrastructure for generations. The essence of Sanders' message is that this is not a side issue, it is central to the future of healthcare and democracy. If a prominent candidate like Kennedy can successfully promote skepticism about vaccines without being held accountable, it sets a dangerous precedent. It tells the public that scientific facts are negotiable, that health policy can be shaped by conspiracy theories, and that leaders need not answer for the broader consequences of their claims. Sanders insists that the public deserves better. The public deserves leaders who acknowledge science, protect the vulnerable, and make policy based on evidence rather than ideology. It is also worth noting that Sanders is not simply attacking Kennedy personally. His call is more about principles than individuals. He is essentially asking society, what kind of leadership do we want, and what kind of ideas do we allow into our national conversation? Kennedy is just one example, but the issue is larger than him. If Americans tolerate misinformation on vaccines from one candidate, what other scientific truths might be undermined tomorrow? Climate change, nutrition, mental health. Sanders wants the public to recognize the slippery slope of allowing pseudoscience into political platforms. Ultimately, Sanders' comment, while brief, opens the door to a much larger discussion. It is about more than vaccines, it is about truth, trust, and the responsibility of leaders. In an age where information is abundant but not always reliable, leaders like Sanders feel the burden of ensuring that scientific integrity is not drowned out by louder, more sensational voices. Kennedy's views on vaccines provide a test case. Will America prioritize evidence-based policy, or will it allow populist rhetoric to define its future? Sanders' warning is clear: this decision has consequences not just for politics but for the health and safety of every citizen. In this way, Sanders is using his platform to redirect the conversation. Rather than allowing the debate to center on personalities, he insists on discussing what truly matters. Vaccines are not just a scientific achievement, they are a social contract, a collective effort to protect one another. If that contract is broken, society risks returning to a time when preventable diseases were rampant and deadly. Sanders' insistence on confronting Kennedy's views head-on is therefore not just political strategy, it is a defense of science, of truth, and of the lives that depend on both. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has built his public image not only on his family's political legacy but also on his reputation as someone unafraid to challenge mainstream narratives. Over the years, he has taken positions that have placed him at odds with both major political parties, and none of his stances has been more controversial than his views on vaccines. His repeated claims questioning vaccine safety, while rejected by nearly every major scientific and medical institution, have nonetheless drawn significant public attention. This attention is exactly what Bernie Sanders is pointing to when he insists that discussions about Kennedy should focus on his vaccine views. Sanders' concern is not merely academic, it is rooted in the real-world consequences of how misinformation spreads and influences behavior. Kennedy often frames his arguments around the themes of personal freedom, bodily autonomy, and skepticism of large pharmaceutical corporations. He argues that the pharmaceutical industry has too much power over government agencies, doctors, and the media, leading to corruption and hidden dangers in vaccines. This rhetoric resonates with a certain audience, particularly people who already distrust powerful institutions. The appeal is emotional rather than scientific. It taps into the long-standing American tradition of questioning authority and demanding individual choice. Yet this framing poses a profound risk. It implies that scientific consensus is nothing more than propaganda pushed by elites, rather than the result of rigorous research and decades of evidence. Sanders views this framing as deeply problematic. While he himself is no defender of corporate greed, indeed, he has built his career criticizing large corporations and their influence over politics, he draws a sharp distinction between criticizing profit-driven practices and denying scientific fact. To Sanders, Kennedy's views cross a line. Questioning the fairness of the healthcare system is one thing, undermining vaccines is another. Vaccines are not just another product of big business, they are a proven public good that has saved millions of lives. By blurring the line between legitimate corporate criticism and unfounded medical claims, Kennedy risks eroding public trust in one of the most important pillars of modern medicine. The controversy is magnified by the fact that Kennedy is not an obscure figure. He is the son of Robert F. Kennedy and the nephew of President John F. Kennedy. This family legacy carries enormous weight in American culture and politics. For many people, the Kennedy name still symbolizes hope, reform, and progress. When someone with that name takes a strong public stance, especially on an issue as crucial as vaccines, it inevitably carries more influence than if it came from an ordinary activist or blogger. Sanders understands this influence, which is why he insists that Kennedy's views must be publicly debated and not allowed to stand unchallenged. The scientific community has been nearly unanimous in rejecting Kennedy's claims. Organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention (CDC), the World Health Organization (WHO), and the American Medical Association have repeatedly emphasized the safety and effectiveness of vaccines. Decades of peer-reviewed research support the conclusion that vaccines are essential to preventing disease outbreaks. Nonetheless, the persistence of anti-vaccine narratives demonstrates how facts alone are not always enough to sway public opinion. Sanders' statement is a recognition of this reality, that politics is not just about facts but about framing, narrative, and emotion. If Kennedy's narrative goes unchallenged, it risks normalizing misinformation. Part of what makes this debate so critical is that vaccine skepticism is no longer a fringe idea. In the United States, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic, millions of people expressed doubts about vaccines. Some refused them entirely, others delayed them, and many shared misinformation online. Social media platforms became breeding grounds for conspiracy theories about microchips, altered DNA, and hidden government agendas. Kennedy's voice, amplified by his reputation and political platform, can serve as a legitimizing force for these conspiracy theories. Sanders, who has always emphasized the need for collective responsibility in health and social issues, sees this as a direct threat to the principle of shared public safety. Another aspect that Sanders implicitly highlights is the generational responsibility involved in this debate. Vaccines are not just about the individual making a choice, they are about the broader community. A parent who refuses to vaccinate their child is not only making a decision for that child but also for every person that child comes into contact with. Herd immunity, the principle that protects vulnerable populations such as infants and the elderly, depends on widespread vaccine adoption. Kennedy's views, if widely accepted, could weaken herd immunity and open the door to the resurgence of diseases once thought to be under control. Sanders is essentially saying that Kennedy's rhetoric, if unchecked, does not just endanger those who believe it, but the entire community. The political stakes are also high. Kennedy is positioning himself as an alternative to the traditional two-party system, appealing to voters frustrated with both Democrats and Republicans. His anti-establishment tone resonates with people who feel ignored by mainstream politics. However, this outsider appeal comes with risks. By elevating vaccine skepticism into a mainstream political debate, Kennedy forces the issue into the heart of American democracy. This is not just about health policy, it is about whether the nation will allow scientifically unsupported ideas to shape its political future. Sanders, recognizing this danger, insists that the focus remain squarely on Kennedy's vaccine views. In doing so, he signals that this issue is not just one of many, it is a litmus test for responsible leadership. Critics of Kennedy argue that his views are not only scientifically inaccurate but also exploitative. By presenting himself as a truth-teller fighting against corrupt elites, he gains followers who see him as a champion of freedom. Yet this framing obscures the harm his ideas could cause. It is easier to inspire distrust than to build trust. It is easier to plant doubt than to provide evidence strong enough to erase it. Sanders understands this imbalance and wants to shift the political dialogue back toward trust in science, not distrust of it. What makes Sanders' stance especially interesting is his balance. Unlike some politicians who dismiss anti-vaccine advocates as irrational or ignorant, Sanders recognizes the deeper social forces at work. People who distrust vaccines often do so because they distrust the institutions that promote them. This distrust is not baseless, it is fueled by decades of corporate misconduct, government failures, and systemic inequality. Sanders acknowledges these realities, but he refuses to let them justify abandoning science. His message is clear: You can criticize corporations, fight for healthcare reform, and demand accountability from the government without rejecting vaccines. These are not mutually exclusive positions. In this sense, Sanders is drawing a line in the sand. He is saying that the fight for justice cannot come at the expense of truth. Kennedy's views, while appealing to a sense of rebellion against authority, ultimately undermine the collective good. Vaccines represent one of the few areas where human progress has been undeniable, where science has delivered tangible, measurable benefits for billions of people. Sanders' insistence on focusing on Kennedy's views is a way of protecting that progress. As the debate continues, it becomes clear that the issue is bigger than Kennedy or Sanders. It is about what kind of society America wants to be, one that builds policy on science, evidence, and collective responsibility, or one that allows charismatic voices to erode trust in proven solutions. Sanders' statement is not just a critique of Kennedy but a call to action for everyone who values truth over ideology. The stakes are not abstract, they are measured in lives saved or lost.